You know that exact feeling, right? Like you're just sitting at your desk on a random Tuesday, maybe you're casually checking your phone while drinking your morning coffee, and a message pops up.
Oh, yeah. The dread.
Right. It's a text from your partner saying, we really need to talk about how you handled things last night. Or, I don't know, maybe you check your inbox and there's a calendar invite from your boss for an unexpected 4 p.m. performance alignment meeting.
With zero context.
Exactly. No context, just those words. And instantly, before you even consciously process the words, before your logical brain has time to form a single thought, your stomach just drops into your shoes.
Oh, your entire physiology changes in a millisecond.
Yes. You get that hot, prickly flash of sweat at the back of your neck, your heart rate violently spikes, your breathing gets really shallow. It's this completely visceral, deeply physical sensation.
I mean, it's an absolute physiological cascade.
Right.
If we hooked you up to a heart rate monitor and like a skin conductance sensor, in that exact moment, your body is reacting as if a literal physical predator just walked into the room.
Like a tiger is standing right next to your desk.
Exactly. It's pumping cortisol and adrenaline into your bloodstream to prepare you to fight for your life or, run for the hills. But of course, there is no tiger. All you're looking at is a glowing glass rectangle with a few pixels of text on it.
Which is just wild to me. The tension there is incredible, right? Because think about it. We are told constantly by modern culture that, feedback is a gift.
Oh, right. The breakfast of champions?
Yeah. We plaster it on corporate motivational posters in the break room. Yet our biology treats a piece of constructive criticism like a lethal threat. So that's what we're doing today. We are going on a mission. We are taking a massive deep dive into mapping the hidden, deeply complex psychological machinery of human defensiveness.
It's going to be intense.
We aren't just going to look at how you react to criticism. We are going to figure out exactly why you psychologically, biologically, and emotionally need to react that way.
And it is a truly fascinating descent. We're going to peel back the layers of the human psyche, really, step by step. We'll start at the surface with everyday feedback triggers, the behavioral stuff we all recognize.
The stuff we do at work every day.
Right. But then we're going to sink down into the unconscious defense mechanisms that your mind deploys totally behind your back to protect your identity.
I can't wait for that part.
Yeah. And from there, we'll go even deeper into the hyper-reactive neurological hardware. Things like rejection-sensitive dysphoria, which sits right at the intersection of trauma and neuroscience.
Wow.
And finally, we'll explore the extreme, darkest pathology of feedback reception, which is vulnerable narcissism and what clinical psychologists call humiliated fury.
Okay, let's unpack this because I want to start at the surface and dig down. Why do we inherently fear criticism? The sources we're looking at point out that criticism threatens our deeply held fundamental need for safety. It actually triggers these latent childhood feelings of basic unacceptability.
Right, and if we go 5 layers deeper on that to really understand the why, we have to look at survival. I mean, as human beings, we are profoundly social primates.
You need the group.
Exactly. For hundreds of thousands of years, our survival historically depended entirely on belonging to the tribe. If you were rejected by the tribe, if they deemed you inadequate or a burden, you were cast out into the wilderness.
Which meant death.
Certain death, starvation, or predators.
Yeah.
So when someone criticizes you today, even in a highly sterile, competitive, modern corporate society, your primal brain hasn't updated its software.
It still thinks we're in the woods.
It does. It interprets that judgment as a threat of social ostracization. It screams, if they don't value me, they will exile me, and I will die.
That makes so much sense of the sheer panic we feel. It's not just, I made a typo in this report. It's, I am going to die alone in the woods.
Precisely. And it compounds when we look at early childhood development. In childhood, our parents represent absolute authority. They are literal gods to an infant or a toddler, and they are the child's sole source of survival.
Right.
If a parent's criticism isn't delivered with immense tact and repair, if a parent looks at a child with disgust or harsh judgment, a child doesn't have the cognitive capacity to think, oh, my mother's just stressed from work and I made a mistake.
They just internalize it.
They absolutely internalize it, not as I did a bad thing, but as I am a fundamentally unacceptable person. It becomes an identity wound.
So the stakes feel existentially high right from the jump, and that perfectly frames the work of Douglas Stone and Sheila Heen. They are giants in the field of conflict resolution, and they've identified 3 specific, distinct triggers that entirely block our ability to receive feedback.
The big 3.
Right. The first is the truth trigger, which is feeling the feedback is just flat out wrong, unfair, or unhelpful.
Mhm.
The second is the relationship trigger, where you completely ignore what is being said because you are so fiercely focused on who is saying it.
Mhm.
And the third is the identity trigger, feeling like the feedback completely shatters your core foundational story of who you are.
Let's really examine what happens when these triggers fire, because it results in a massive cascade of cognitive distortions. Let's look at the truth trigger first.
Okay, yeah.
When that fires, people immediately engage in a cognitive distortion that Stone and Heen brilliantly call wrong spotting. You will intensely, desperately scan the criticism, looking for one tiny factual error, one slight exaggeration, or one out-of-context detail.
It's like being a lawyer cross-examining a hostile witness. You're just looking for a loophole.
Exactly like a hostile lawyer.
Yeah.
Let's say your manager tells you, "You've been late to our morning meetings 3 times this week, and it's disrupting the workflow." But in reality, you were only late twice, and the third time you were technically in the room, but getting coffee in the back.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Your brain will latch onto that discrepancy immediately.
Yeah.
Will say, "That is factually untrue. I was here on Wednesday." Once you find that minor discrepancy, your ego uses it to completely dismiss the entire critique.
You throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Right. It is a brilliant, immediate defense of the ego to avoid feeling the shame of being disruptive.
But wait, let me push back here for a second. What if the feedback is just objectively wrong? Isn't wrong spotting just a healthy defense of the truth? I mean, if my boss says I'm late 3 times and I literally wasn't, shouldn't I defend the facts? Why is it a distortion to point out the truth?
It's a highly valid question,
Yeah.
and you absolutely should advocate for the truth. I mean, sometimes feedback is just factually incorrect, and toxic environments will try to gaslight you into accepting false feedback.
Exactly.
However, we have to look at the underlying emotional necessity driving the reaction to the feedback.
What do you mean by the emotional necessity?
Well, often our biological baseline and our emotional wiring distort reality before we can objectively assess it. The issue with wrong spotting isn't that you're correcting a record, it's that you are using a 10% inaccuracy to completely invalidate the 90% of the feedback that is true and vital for your growth.
I get it.
Even if the feedback is 90% true and 10% false, a defensive mind will zero in on that 10% to protect its fragile self-concept. The rejection of the feedback in that moment is less about objective truth and much more about averting the psychological pain of inadequacy. You aren't defending the truth, you are defending your ego from feeling small.
Wow. Okay, so wrong spotting is essentially using a technicality to get your ego off the hook. That makes sense. And that leads us right into the relationship trigger, where we see something called switch tracking. I find this one so relatable it almost hurts.
Switch tracking is incredibly common, especially in romantic relationships and close team dynamics. Switch tracking is when the feedback recipient unconsciously changes the subject from the performance critique to a relational grievance, and it happens in the blink of an eye.
Give me a scenario, like how does this play out?
So let's say your partner says to you, "Hey, you left your dirty dishes in the sink again, and it makes me feel like you don't respect my time." If your relationship trigger fires, you don't respond to the issue of the dishes. Instead, you reply, "Well, you don't have to speak to me in that patronizing, aggressive tone."
Oh man, I've seen that happen. Honestly, I've probably done that.
Most of us have. And look at what just happened. Suddenly, there are two parallel, totally disconnected conversations happening simultaneously. Person A is talking about dirty dishes and respect. Person B has completely switched the track and is now talking about tone of voice and emotional safety.
You're just talking past one another.
Exactly. The original feedback about the dishes is permanently lost in the ether because the ego found it easier to attack the delivery of the feedback rather than sit with the shame of the content of the feedback.
That is wild. It's literally like throwing a smoke bomb in the middle of an argument and running away in the confusion. And all of this ties back to what the sources call the blind spot gap. This blew my mind when I read it. We evaluate ourselves based on our internal feelings and our positive intentions, right?
Yes, our intentions are everything to us.
Right. Like when I leave the dishes in the sink, my internal narrative is, I'm exhausted, I worked a 10-hour day, I fully intend to do them tomorrow, but the rest of the world. They evaluate us based on our actions, our behavior, and our leaky nonverbal cues, like our tone, our facial expressions. We literally do not see the same reality.
We truly don't. We judge ourselves by our invisible intentions, but the world judges us by our visible impact. And when those two things collide, the identity trigger fires.
Right, and this reaction isn't a simple one-size-fits-all thing. Our sources from the behavioral science side, specifically looking at the Big Five personality traits and MBTI personality typologies, show that our hardwiring heavily dictates how we receive these triggers.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
The architecture of our personality changes the shape of our defensiveness entirely.
The psychometrics here are revealing, right? Let's take the trait of neuroticism from the Big Five, which measures emotional stability and reactivity to stress.
Yeah, so high neuroticism individuals experience negative information not just as helpful data, but as a literal existential threat. Their nervous system is wired to scan for danger constantly.
So they're always on edge.
Always. So they will often seek out reassurance-based feedback. They'll constantly ask, I'm doing okay, right? You're not mad at me? But they will actively, desperately avoid genuine appraisal. Why? Because a genuine appraisal might confirm their deepest, darkest fears of inadequacy.
And what about the other end of the spectrum, like high agreeableness?
Highly agreeable people are wired for social harmony and cooperation. They interpret constructive critique as a social or relational rupture. If you give them feedback, they won't fight you. They will outwardly comply.
They just nod along.
Yes. They will nod, smile, and apologize profusely to preserve the harmony of the room. But inwardly, they are experiencing intense hidden distress. They are ruminating on the fact that they disappointed you because their sense of safety comes from social cohesion.
Okay, so that's the Big Five. But if we look at the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the MBTI, it gets incredibly specific about how we process data. Let's take a classic workplace scenario to map this out. A manager sits down with an employee and says, "Your presentation today lost the audience at the 20-minute mark. It was just too long and convoluted."
A perfect scenario to illustrate cognitive gating. If that employee is an MBTI T-type, a thinking type like an INTJ or INTP, especially if they are also highly conscientious and low in agreeableness, they're going to evaluate that feedback purely on its logical merit and empirical evidence.
So they aren't going to cry. They're going to, what, demand a spreadsheet.
Exactly. If the manager's feedback is vague or subjective, the T-type will dismiss it entirely. They will literally devalue the critic's authority in their own mind.
Just write them off.
Right. The employee will think, you don't have the data to back that up. You didn't measure audience engagement metrics. Therefore, your opinion is illogical and irrelevant. It's a defense mechanism dressed up as intellectual rigor. They miss highly valuable interpersonal feedback because they invalidate the source for not being logical enough.
But if that same employee is an F-type, a feeling type, like an INFP or an ENFP, that exact same feedback about a 20-minute presentation is a direct, catastrophic hit to the identity trigger.
Precisely. F-types, particularly the NF-types, invest their genuine, authentic self into their work. Their output is an extension of their soul. So criticizing the pacing of the presentation isn't a critique of the PowerPoint slides. It feels like an indictment of their core value as a human being. The underlying psychological mechanism here is that they operate from internal values rather than external objective metrics.
So the stakes are totally internal for them.
Yes. When the external metric, the manager says, this presentation failed, the INFP feels in their bones, I am a failure. They aren't just defending a project, they are fighting for their psychological survival. It is an incredibly painful way to navigate corporate environments, which usually don't care about your soul, they just care about the slides.
That sounds exhausting. Okay, so we spent a lot of time on the conscious reactions, like the triggers, the personality types, the immediate behavioral responses. But what happens when we go deeper? What's happening in the dark, below the surface of our awareness? I want to sink down into the unconscious machinery, protecting the ego from all this anxiety and shame. We're talking about defense mechanisms.
This takes us right into the realm of classical psychoanalysis. The concept originates with Sigmund Freud in the late 19th century and was vastly expanded, refined, and cataloged by his daughter, Anna Freud. To put it simply, a defense mechanism is an unconscious psychological strategy deployed by the ego to distort, transform, or falsify reality.
Let me stop you there just to clarify. It's unconscious, meaning I don't wake up in the morning and decide I'm going to deploy a defense mechanism today.
Exactly. If you are aware you're doing it, it's a coping strategy, not a defense mechanism. A defense mechanism happens behind your back. Your ego does it to you to protect you. The goal is to cope with internal conflict and protect the self from overwhelming anxiety, shame, or emotional distress.
So it's like a bodyguard you don't even know you hired.
That's a great way to put it. And these defenses exist on a developmental spectrum, ranging from highly primitive mechanisms we use as infants to highly mature mechanisms we develop as well-adjusted adults.
Let's categorize these because the source material breaks them down into specific layers, and it's fascinating to see where we all fall. At the very bottom, you have the primitive or immature defenses. You have denial, which is literally refusing to acknowledge reality. It's the classic childhood mentality of, if I close my eyes and don't acknowledge the monster isn't happening.
And we see denial in adults all the time. An alcoholic who refuses to admit their drinking is destroying their marriage is in deep denial. Then, moving slightly up it, but still very primitive, you have splitting. Splitting is viewing people, experiences, or yourself as entirely 100% good or entirely 100% bad. There is no gray area.
Why do we do that? What is the function of seeing someone as all good or all bad? It seems counterproductive.
It stems from a lack of what psychologists call emotional object constancy. Melanie Klein, a pioneer in psychoanalysis, observed this in infants.
Right.
An infant has a mother who feeds them, cuddles them, and makes them feel safe. That is the good mother. But sometimes the mother is exhausted, she delays feeding, she puts the baby down when it wants to be held. That is the bad mother.
Right, because the baby is frustrated.
Exactly.
Right.
But an infant's undeveloped mind is terrified by ambivalence. It is too anxiety-provoking for a baby to realize that the person who guarantees their survival, the good mother, is the exact same person who is currently frustrating them, the bad mother.
So they just compartmentalize it completely.
Yes. The infant's ego splits them into two entirely different entities to protect the pure good image. In healthy development, we grow out of this. We learn that people are complex and flawed. But in adults with certain trauma backgrounds or personality disorders, they still split. A boss giving them praise is an absolute hero. The minute the boss gives them critical feedback, the boss becomes a malevolent, evil monster. There is no middle ground.
That sounds exhausting to live with. And then, staying in the primitive tier, we have perhaps the most complex one. Projective identification. I want to spend some time here because this goes way beyond simple projection, right? Simple projection is just me feeling insecure, so I accuse you of being insecure.
Right. Simple projection is just attributing your own unacceptable feelings to someone else. But projective identification is deeply interpersonal and wildly manipulative, albeit unconsciously. You don't just project your intolerable, unacceptable feelings onto someone else. You actually interact with them in such a highly provocative, subtle way that you make them experience those exact feelings of anger or inadequacy.
You force them to feel it.
Yes.
Yeah.
You force them to become the container for the emotions you cannot handle.
Okay, I love analogies, so let me try to map this out visually. It's like your ego is a medieval castle, and it's under siege by an army called criticism and shame. Denial is simply pulling up the drawbridge, closing the gates, and pretending the army isn't out there.
Right.
Compartmentalization, which is a secondary defense, is locking different contradictory thoughts in different dungeon cells so they never talk to each other.
I like this. Keep going.
But projective identification, that is like taking the plague that is currently ravaging your own citizens inside the castle walls, putting the infected bodies on catapults, and actively throwing the plague over the castle walls to infect the attacking army. You are making them sick with your disease so you don't have to suffer alone.
What's fascinating here is how beautifully that captures the interpersonal dynamic of it. You are outsourcing your psychological plague. Let's put it in a real-world context. Imagine a person who secretly feels completely incompetent at their job. This feeling is intolerable to them. So they unconsciously deploy projective identification. They start constantly forgetting to send crucial emails to their partner. They make sloppy mistakes that force their partner to clean up after them. They act helpless.
Driving their partner crazy in the process.
Exactly. Until eventually the partner snaps. The partner blows up, starts yelling, and feels completely overwhelmed and incompetent in managing the workload. At that moment, the first person can step back, look at their partner, and say, wow, you are really unstable and bad at handling stress.
Oh my God, that is so manipulative.
Yes. They've successfully ejected their own feelings of incompetence and forced the partner to feel it and act it out. The environment has been forced to mirror the individual's internal chaos.
That is deeply unsettling, but also makes so much sense of toxic workplace dynamics. Okay, let's climb up the maturity ladder. We move out of the primitive tier and hit the neurotic or secondary defenses. Displacement is the classic trope here.
Yes, displacement is redirecting emotional energy, usually anger, to a safer, less threatening target. Your boss humiliates you in a meeting. You can't yell at your boss because you need your paycheck and you'll get fired. So you hold it in, you go home, and the second you walk in the door, you scream at your spouse for leaving a pair of shoes in the hallway. or you kick the dog.
You displace the anxiety onto a target that cannot destroy you. We also see reaction formation. This one is wild. It's overcompensating by expressing the exact opposite of your true, unacceptable feelings. The classic example in the sources is a man who feels deeply, unconsciously insecure about his masculinity, or perhaps has latent homosexual desires that his conscious mind finds utterly unacceptable due to his upbringing. So his ego defends against this by making him act overly aggressive, fiercely domineering, and violently homophobic. He expresses the extreme opposite of his hidden truth.
And then there is intellectualization, which is a brilliant, highly sophisticated evasion tactic. You see this a lot in highly educated, articulate people. They strip the feedback or the trauma of its emotional reality and turn it into a sterile academic analysis.
So instead of crying because they failed, they give you a TED Talk about failure.
Basically, yes. A doctor who receives a devastating diagnosis might spend hours researching the cellular biology of the disease, talking clinically about mortality rates and treatment protocols. They talk abstractly about the concept of the disease to entirely avoid feeling the raw, unmitigated terror of dying. In feedback, an employee might debate the philosophical validity of the performance metric to avoid feeling the shame of underperforming.
And the research by Robert Plutchik adds such a cool evolutionary layer to this. He was the psychologist who viewed these defense mechanisms not just as abstract Freudian concepts, but as direct derivatives of basic biological emotions. So reaction formation isn't just a trick of the mind, it relates biologically to the emotion of joy or mania. Projection relates to the biological emotion of disgust and paranoia. Displacement is a direct derivative of anger and hostility. It's like the raw emotion mutates into the psychological defense.
Exactly. The emotion is the fuel, and the defense mechanism is the engine that burns it. And finally, at the highest level of psychological development, you have mature defenses. The gold standard here is sublimation. This is the ability to channel unacceptable raw urges or profound pain into productive, socially acceptable, even beautiful outlets.
Like art, right?
Yes, exactly like art. The grieving parent who channels their profound, world-shattering sorrow into founding a charity that saves lives. The heartbroken musician who turns their devastation into a masterpiece album.
It's transformative.
It is. Sublimation benefits both the individual by processing the pain and society by producing something of value. But if we stay focused on those lower-level primitive and neurotic defenses, we see how they severely distort the reality of any feedback we receive. The ego is working overtime, deploying plagues and smoke bombs to prevent the self from collapsing under the weight of perceived rejection.
Okay, so we've covered the software. The psychological programming, the ego defenses, the cognitive triggers. But here's where it gets really interesting. What happens when the problem isn't the software? What happens when the problem is the biological hardware itself? What happens when the nervous system is physically, neurologically hyper-reactive to criticism? I want to pivot and talk about highly sensitive persons, or HSPs, and specifically rejection-sensitive dysphoria.
To understand this, we first have to lay the groundwork by introducing sensory processing sensitivity, or SPS. This is not a disorder. It is an innate biological temperament trait found in roughly 15 to 20% of the population, and actually found in over 100 other species.
Wait, really? Animals can be highly sensitive?
Absolutely. Fruit flies, fish, dogs, primates. In evolutionary biology, it pays to have a small percentage of your population be highly attuned to danger. The research literature uses the acronym DOE-S to describe this trait. D for depth of processing, O for overstimulation, E for emotionality and empathy, and S for attention to subtle stimuli.
So they're taking in a lot more information.
For highly sensitive people, their nervous system is finely tuned. They pick up microexpressions, shifts in tone, and environmental cues that the other 80% of the population completely misses.
And the neurological routing for that data is different, right? When an HSP receives negative feedback, it doesn't take the normal highway through the brain.
That's right. In a neurotypical brain, constructive criticism goes to the neocortex first. The neocortex is the logical, analytical, thinking part of the brain. It says, okay, let's evaluate this data. But for an HSP, especially when triggered, that routing gets bypassed. The negative feedback is routed straight into the emotional limbic system.
So straight to the alarm bell.
Yes. The amygdala, which is the brain's threat detection center, sounds the alarm instantly. The individual literally cannot remain objective in the moment because their brain has hijacked the processing power to deal with what it perceives as an emotional emergency. And worse, the limbic system has access to emotional memory.
Oh, wow.
So one piece of critical feedback today instantly activates all past memories of shame and criticism simultaneously.
Which brings us to the extreme end of this spectrum. RSD, rejection-sensitive dysphoria. Let's really break this down because I know a lot of people have heard this term on social media lately, but might not understand the clinical reality of it. This is characterized by an intense, literally physically painful emotional reaction to perceived rejection, exclusion, or criticism. And the sources point out it is heavily comorbid with neurodivergence, specifically ADHD and autism.
Let's go 5 layers deep on the neurology of RSD, because it is fascinating and deeply misunderstood. What is functionally happening in the brain is frontal limbic dysregulation.
Okay, break that down for me. Explain that like I'm 5.
Okay, imagine your brain as a car. The amygdala is the engine that provides the raw emotional power and the alarm bells. The prefrontal cortex is the brakes. It's responsible for executive function, logic, and regulating those emotions.
Right.
In a neurotypical brain, when the engine revs too high, like when someone criticizes you, the brakes engage. The prefrontal cortex says, calm down, it's just a performance review.
Right.
But in an ADHD brain experiencing RSD, the brakes fail. The prefrontal cortex fails to inhibit the amygdala.
So that engine just redlines.
It redlines instantly.
Yeah.
And when this disapproval is perceived, this dysregulation causes a sudden catastrophic drop in dopamine. Now, we normally think of dopamine as the reward chemical, like what we get when we eat chocolate or win a game.
Yeah, the feel-good stuff.
Exactly. But dopamine also plays a crucial role in regulating emotional pain. When it plummets catastrophically, the emotional pain isn't just a sad feeling. It is registered in the central nervous system as literal physical agony. Patients constantly describe RSD as feeling like they were punched in the chest or physically stabbed.
A physical blow. That is astonishing. So you have a brain that essentially punishes you with excruciating physical pain if you feel rejected or criticized. The behavioral adaptations to survive that kind of brain must be extreme. How do people live with that?
The adaptations are severe, and they shape the person's entire life trajectory. You see 2 main behavioral paths. The first is high-performing perfectionism. These people become flawless overachievers, the ultimate people pleasers, simply to build a fortress against any possible criticism. If they are perfect, no one can criticize them, and they won't feel the pain.
But they must be exhausted all the time.
They are chronically burned out. And the second path is avoidance. You see preemptive relationship abandonment and abandonment. They will abruptly leave a loving relationship at the very first sign of friction, leaving before they can be left.
Just burning bridges to stay safe.
Right. You see brilliant people drop out of graduate programs or quitting lucrative jobs after a single mild piece of critical feedback. They will torch their own lives just to escape the threat of exposure to that pain.
Okay, I have to ask for clarification here because I've heard this debated in psychology circles. If RSD isn't currently an official distinct diagnosis in the DSM-5, the diagnostic manual, how do clinicians even treat it? And why does the clinical distinction between RSD and something like borderline personality disorder matter so much? Because they sound very similar on the surface.
It matters immensely, and it is a tragedy when it is misdiagnosed, because treating RSD as borderline personality disorder costs people years of incorrect, ineffective therapy. Let's distinguish them. BPD and RSD both feature extreme, agonizing sensitivity to abandonment and rejection.
Right, that's the overlap.
But BPD involves a pervasive, chronic instability of identity. The individual with BPD struggles with chronic emptiness and a fractured sense of self across all domains of life. They don't know who they are.
And RSD is different.
RSD is episodic and situational. It's an event-based trigger. Someone with RSD can have a devastating 45-minute emotional meltdown over an unreturned text message from a friend. They might cry, panic, and feel physically ill. But once the perceived rejection is resolved, the friend texts back and says, "Sorry, my phone died." The person with RSD can entirely reset. The pain evaporates, and they can be highly functional, happy, and regulated the next day. Their core identity is stable, albeit often heavily shame-based. They know who they are. They just deeply fear disappointing others.
That distinction is so clarifying.
Also, we have to differentiate RSD from social anxiety. Social anxiety is anticipatory. It's the dread before you go to the party. What if they don't like me? RSD is reactive. It's the catastrophic crash after you perceive a slight at the party. And finally, we have to distinguish it from CPTSD, complex PTSD.
Perfect trauma.
Exactly. CPTSD requires a documentable history of chronic relational trauma, like severe childhood abuse. RSD, however, can exist in someone who had a perfectly lovely childhood, because it is tied to neurodevelopmental hardware differences like ADHD. It's how the brain is wired, not just what happened to it.
So RSD is a shame-based but deeply other-oriented identity. They are terrified of losing the people they care about. And that distinction is the perfect bridge, because I want to pivot sharply. We are about to transition into the absolute darkest pathology of feedback reception. How does this other-oriented shame of RSD differ from vulnerable narcissism? Because both of these psychological profiles feature an extreme, explosive hypersensitivity to criticism, but the engine underneath the hood is entirely different.
The engine couldn't be more different. It is the difference between protecting a connection to others and protecting a delusion of superiority. RSD is other-oriented. Vulnerable narcissism is completely self-oriented. The narcissist isn't trying to preserve a relationship. They are protecting a highly fragile, grandiose false self.
Let's define this, because we usually think of narcissists as the loud, grandiose, boastful types. The CEO on a stage, the arrogant celebrity. But the sources highlight vulnerable or covert narcissists. They don't look like Tony Stark.
Not at all.
They are introverted, deeply resentful, highly defensive, and play the victim. They secretly believe they are fundamentally superior to everyone else, but they require the external world to constantly validate that secret genius. And what happens when the world doesn't?
That is when you see what psychoanalysts call the narcissistic injury. And to truly understand this, we need to look at the main character analogy from the psychiatrist Heinz Kohut and contemporary psychoanalytic thought. A narcissistic injury occurs the exact moment the narcissist is violently confronted with the objective reality that they are not the main character in the movie of life.
The source material has this incredibly powerful, chilling example to illustrate this. Let's walk through it. It says the worst thing that can happen to a vulnerable narcissist is not that his wife cheats on him and leaves him for another man in a dramatic, explosive, screaming confrontation in the driveway.
No, the narcissist can actually survive that dramatic confrontation quite well. Because in that dramatic breakup, he is still the absolute star of the movie.
Yeah.
It's a tragedy now, but the plot revolves entirely around him, his pain, his betrayal. He gets to be the magnificent victim.
So what is the ultimate injury?
The ultimate narcissistic injury is if his wife cheats on him secretly, maintains a totally independent, fulfilling life outside of him, finds joy with other people, and he never even knows.
Wow.
Because that means she exists completely independently of him. She has her own movie, and he's not even an extra in it. He is irrelevant to her internal world. That realization, the horror of irrelevance, the realization that other people have sovereign minds, shatters the false self. It's intolerable.
The horror of irrelevance, that is so dark. And the progression of the psychology is fascinating. The sources draw a distinction between a wound and a scar here.
Yes, and it's a vital distinction. A narcissistic wound is an early, repeated threat to this grandiose false self, usually occurring in childhood. It's the world or a parent continually failing to recognize their supposed specialness, or alternating between idealizing them and ignoring them. A narcissistic scar is the highly calcified, repeated psychological defense mechanism built up over decades to protect against that wound and preserve the delusion of superiority.
And when that scar tissue is pierced by criticism, when the false self actually cracks, we don't just see sadness. We don't see the panic of RSD. We see narcissistic rage and what is clinically termed humiliated fury.
Yes. When the narcissist decompensates, when their ego defenses completely fail, the resulting rage is not just standard anger. It is a terrifying, explosive, often violent attempt to silence critics, suppress dissidents, and forcibly restore their dominance and their false narrative. The research outlines 4 distinct stages to this rage.
Let's walk through a scenario to see those stages in action. Let's say a mid-level manager who is a vulnerable narcissist submits a proposal. A junior subordinate mildly corrects a data point in the proposal during a meeting. What happens? Stage 1 is frustration of supply.
Correct. In stage 1, the manager is denied the admiration they feel entitled to. They expected applause. They got a correction from someone that they view as inferior. Stage 2. This frustration causes a profound narcissistic injury. The false self, the delusion of absolute perfection, is threatened with public exposure.
And then stage 3 is where it gets dangerous.
Stage 3 is the deployment of projection. It's malignant. They project their own internalized bad object, their own deeply buried feelings of worthlessness and malice onto the junior subordinate. Suddenly, in the manager's mind, the subordinate isn't just someone giving helpful feedback. The subordinate is a malevolent, evil, jealous entity trying to destroy them.
And stage 4 is the explosion.
Stage 4 is raging against this perceived malevolent entity. The manager will scream, demean, threaten to fire, or actively sabotage the subordinate's career. But here is the paradox that really stands out in the literature. Vulnerable narcissists often direct this world-ending aggression at totally insignificant targets when they can't attack the real source. They use displacement.
Right, because if the person who criticized them is the CEO, they can't scream at the CEO.
Exactly.
So they suffer the injury at work, smile tightly, and then go to a restaurant and absolutely berate a waitress for bringing the wrong soup. Or they scream at a taxi driver. Or, astoundingly, they direct the fury at themselves through unhedonic boredom, substance abuse, or self-harm.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is a profoundly tragic, albeit destructive architecture. The narcissist's rage, whether directed at a terrified subordinate, a waitress, or at their own bodies, is ultimately a desperate, violent attempt to avoid facing their own bottomless feelings of inferiority and shame.
It's all a smokescreen.
It is. The rage serves a purpose. It perpetuates a relationship, even a toxic, fearful one, which keeps them securely in the center of the drama. They would rather be a feared monster than an irrelevant extra.
It's heavy. Really heavy. And it makes you realize how dangerous unprotected feedback can be when it interacts with severe, untreated pathology. But for the vast majority of us listening, we aren't dealing with clinical narcissistic rage. We are just dealing with our own messy human defensiveness, our ego armor, the wrong spotting, the neurological panic of our limbic system.
The everyday struggles.
Right. So we have to ask the practical question. What does this all mean for you, the listener? How do we step out of this matrix of defensiveness? Let's move into our final section, rewiring the machinery. How do we move from ego defense to actual mature integration?
The sources provide highly actionable, evidence-based interventions. And the very first step addresses the hardware we talked about earlier, neurophysiological downregulation. You have to create a pause. Because as we established, if your limbic system is firing, your logical brain is completely offline. You cannot think your way out of a physiological response.
This is where the 24-hour rule comes in.
Exactly. For individuals with high neuroticism or those dealing with ADHD and RSD, instituting a mandatory 24-hour delay between receiving feedback and responding to it is profoundly transformative. It's a boundary you set with yourself.
But waiting is so hard. I mean, when you get that critical email, your blood is boiling. Every fiber of your being wants to type out a furious, defensive 5-paragraph essay proving them wrong and hit send immediately.
Of course it does, because the ego demands immediate vindication to alleviate the pain. But if you force yourself to wait, you allow the dopamine levels to stabilize. You allow the cortisol to flush out of your bloodstream. The amygdala powers down, and the prefrontal cortex, the logical brakes, comes back online. You dramatically reduce defensive distortion just by letting the clock tick.
So the script is just, thank you for the feedback. I want to give this the thought it deserves. I'm going to process this and follow up with you tomorrow. Just that one sentence changes everything. You buy yourself time, and once you have that space, you can practice cognitive diffusion. I found this technique incredible. It's from ACT, or Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, right?
Yes. Cognitive diffusion is about gaining distance. It's stripping words of their absolute gospel-like power. When you are ruminating on a piece of harsh criticism at 2 a.m., your brain treats those words as an absolute verdict on your soul.
It feels like life or death.
But diffusion asks you to play with the medium to change the meaning. Visualize those critical words on a screen in front of you. Change the font to Comic Sans. Change the color to neon pink.
The source from Wondermind even suggests literally singing the words out loud to a silly tune like Happy Birthday or the SpongeBob SquarePants theme.
It sounds utterly ridiculous, but it breaks the psychological spell. You realize, oh, these are just words. They're just sounds vibrating in the air or pixels on a screen. They aren't a lethal weapon. You stop fusing your identity with the critique. You can then treat the criticism as an experiment to test drive, rather than a final judgment from God.
And while you are doing that, while you are buying time and diffusing the words, you must engage in self-soothing and self-validation. This is crucial for the RSD folks and the highly agreeable folks. You have to offer from within what wasn't offered from without.
This is reparenting the self. You have to consciously remind yourself, out loud if necessary, that you can fully accept your fundamental worth as a human being while simultaneously acknowledging that your behavior needs improvement. You have to decouple them.
That is the ultimate key, isn't it? Creating cognitive separation, separating what I made from who I am. If I bake a bad cake, it doesn't mean I am a bad person. It just means I need more flour. If you can shift your brain's immediate primitive response from, that's wrong, you're attacking me, to, tell me more, I'm curious about how you see this, You move from a fight-or-flight survival state into an exploratory learning mindset.
It requires immense vulnerability. It is terrifying to lower the drawbridge.
Yeah.
But it leads to the ultimate marker of mature adaptation, discerning the source. When you are regulated, you learn to differentiate between toxic critics and supportive mentors.
How do you tell the difference when both are giving you negative feedback?
Intent and impact. Toxic critics use evaluation merely to diminish you, to project their own shame, and to elevate themselves. Their feedback is vague, character assassinating, and leaves you feeling hopeless. Supportive mentors, however, offer you painful, precise, necessary truths specifically for your growth. Their feedback is actionable, behavior-focused, and leaves you with a path forward. But you can only tell the difference if you aren't actively defending your ego.
We have covered so much ground today in this deep dive. We started at the very surface, feeling the everyday sting of the identity trigger and the desperate urge to wrong spot our bosses. We dug down through the unconscious medieval ramparts of displacement and projective identification.
We really went everywhere.
We stepped into the neurological lightning storm of rejection-sensitive dysphoria, where a text message literally feels like a physical punch to the chest. And we wandered through the dark, fragile, mirror-lined halls of vulnerable narcissism and humiliated fury.
And we map these depths not to pathologize ourselves, and certainly not to judge ourselves, but to understand the incredible, awe-inspiring lengths our minds will go to protect us from the pain of rejection. We are built to survive. But this raises an important question, one that I want to leave hovering in the air for you to think about long after this deep dive ends.
Let's hear it.
We spend so much of our psychological energy, sometimes our entire lives, building these incredibly elaborate defense mechanisms to keep criticism out. We wrong spot, we switch track, we project, we perfect ourselves. But consider this. What if the armor we wear to protect ourselves from rejection is the exact same barrier that prevents true intimacy and authentic connection from getting in? If you never let anyone see your flaws, you never let anyone love the real you. By desperately protecting our false perfected selves, are we accidentally starving our real selves?
The armor that saves you is the armor that starves you. That is going to stay with me for a very long time. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And maybe, just maybe, try lowering the drawbridge just a little bit.